At 05:30 hours, on July 18, 1940, Chiune Sugihara stood at the window of his second-floor bedroom in the Japanese consulate in Kaunas, Lithuania, looking down at approximately 200 people pressed against the iron fence surrounding the building. More were arriving every few minutes, walking quickly through the pre-dawn darkness. By 600 hours, there were 300. By 700 hours, when the consulate officially opened, there were nearly 500. They were Jewish refugees, mostly from Poland, families with children, elderly couples, young men traveling alone. They had fled the Nazi occupation of Poland that began in September 1939. They had crossed into Soviet-occupied Lithuania seeking safety. Now Lithuania itself was being absorbed into the Soviet Union. Soviet authorities had given foreign diplomats until August 31st to close their consulates and leave. After that date, all foreign diplomatic staff would be expelled, and all refugees remaining in Lithuania would be at the mercy of Soviet authorities, who would likely hand them back to the Germans. The refugees at Sugihara's gate needed transit visas to cross the Soviet Union to Japan. From Japan, they could reach other destinations: America, Palestine, Shanghai, anywhere beyond Nazi reach. Without transit visas, they could not leave Lithuania. Without leaving Lithuania, they would be trapped between the Nazis and the Soviets. Trapped meant dead. Sugihara understood this perfectly. What he did not yet know was whether he would help them. The decision he would make in the next 6 hours would save approximately 6,000 lives directly and create an estimated 40,000 to 100,000 descendants who owe their existence to a Japanese diplomat, who chose to disobey orders from his government. But first, Sugihara had to receive those orders, understand their meaning, and decide whether his conscience or his career mattered more. Chiune Sugihara was born on January 1, 1900, in Yaotsu Gifu Prefecture, Japan. He was the second of 6 children. His father, Yoshimi Sugihara, was a tax official who wanted his son to become a physician. Chiune was intelligent, academically talented, and completely uninterested in medicine. In 1918, he deliberately failed his medical school entrance exams by writing his name and leaving the rest of the exam blank. His father was furious. Chiune used the confrontation to announce he was joining the foreign ministry instead. He passed the foreign ministry entrance exam in 1919 and was assigned to the Harbin office in Manchuria, then part of the Russian Far East. Sugihara spent the 1920s in China and Manchuria learning about Soviet politics and military capabilities, and establishing himself as one of Japan's most effective intelligence officers. He was not a spy in the dramatic sense. He was an analyst who read Soviet newspapers, interviewed refugees from the Soviet Union, and compiled detailed reports on Soviet military strength, economic production, and political stability. His reports were so valuable that by 1932, at age 32, he was appointed Deputy Foreign Minister of Manchukuo, the Japanese puppet state in Manchuria. The position was prestigious and made Sugihara one of the youngest senior diplomats in Japanese service. He held the position for 3 years, negotiating with Soviet officials over border disputes and railroad rights. His counterparts respected him. He spoke fluent Russian, understood Soviet bureaucracy, and never made promises he couldn't keep. In 1935, Sugihara resigned from the Manchukuo government. The resignation was sudden and unexpected. Official records state he resigned for personal reasons. His family later revealed the truth. Sugihara resigned in protest against Japanese treatment of Chinese civilians in Manchuria. He had witnessed Japanese military forces execute Chinese civilians accused of being partisans. He had seen villages burned. He objected formally through official channels. His objections were ignored. He resigned rather than continue serving a government that committed atrocities. The resignation should have ended his diplomatic career. Instead, the foreign ministry transferred him to Moscow as a translator at the Japanese embassy. The transfer was unusual. Diplomats who resigned in protest were typically dismissed entirely. But Sugihara's intelligence value was too high to lose. The foreign ministries needed Russian speakers who understood Soviet politics. They accepted his protest resignation from Manchukuo and reassigned him to work that kept him away from occupation policies. Sugihara served in Moscow from 1937 to 1938. In 1938, he married Yukiko Kikuchi, his second wife. His first marriage in 1924 had ended in divorce. Yukiko was the daughter of a samurai family, educated, intelligent, and willing to accept the uncertain life of a diplomat's wife. They would have 4 sons together. In November 1939, Sugihara was appointed Vice-Consul to Kaunas, Lithuania. The appointment was significant. Lithuania was strategically positioned between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Both powers were maneuvering for control of the Baltic states. Japan needed intelligence on German-Soviet relations, military movements, and political developments. Sugihara's mission was officially diplomatic. His actual job was intelligence gathering. Kaunas in 1939 was a city of 150,000 people, the temporary capital of Lithuania, after Poland seized Vilnius. The city had a large Jewish population, approximately 35,000, about 25% of the total population. Lithuanian Jews were educated, prosperous, and integrated into Lithuanian society. Many were professionals, doctors, lawyers, teachers, merchants. They considered themselves Lithuanians who happened to be Jewish. They had lived in Lithuania for centuries. They felt safe. That safety evaporated on September 1, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. Over 2 million Polish Jews fled east away from the advancing Wehrmacht. Approximately 14,000 crossed into Lithuania, overwhelming Lithuanian border controls. The refugees brought stories of what the Germans were doing: mass executions, ghettos, deportations. Polish Jews in German-occupied territory were being systematically murdered. The refugees who reached Lithuania were the lucky ones who escaped before the borders closed. Lithuania was neutral, caught between Germany and the Soviet Union. The two powers had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact on August 23, 1939, secretly dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. The Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, were assigned to the Soviet sphere. In June 1940, the Soviet Union issued an ultimatum to Lithuania: accept Soviet military bases and Soviet political control, or be invaded. Lithuania accepted. Soviet troops entered Lithuania on June 15, 1940. By July 1940, Lithuania was being absorbed into the Soviet Union as a Soviet Socialist Republic. The Soviet occupation terrified Lithuanian Jews and Polish Jewish refugees. The Soviets were totalitarian and anti-Semitic in practice, if not in doctrine. But the Soviets were not systematically murdering Jews. The Nazis were. Jews in Lithuania understood they had to leave before either the Nazis invaded or the Soviets handed them over to the Nazis. Leaving required visas: a destination visa showing where you intended to go, and transit visas for every country you had to pass through to reach that destination. Most refugees wanted to reach America, Palestine, or Shanghai. America and Palestine had strict immigration quotas. Shanghai was the only major city in the world that accepted Jewish refugees without visas, because Shanghai was controlled by Japan and Japan had not closed its borders to Jewish refugees. But reaching Shanghai from Lithuania required traveling east across the Soviet Union on the Trans-Siberian Railway into Vladivostok, then by ship to Japan, then by ship to Shanghai. The journey required a Soviet transit visa to cross the Soviet Union, a Japanese transit visa to pass through Japan, and a destination visa proving you intended to leave Japan and go somewhere else. The Soviet transit visa was relatively easy to obtain. Soviet authorities wanted refugees out of Lithuania. They issued transit visas readily. The destination visa was also manageable. The Dutch consul in Kaunas, Jan Zwartendijk, was issuing fake destination visas to Curaçao, a Dutch Caribbean colony. The visas falsely stated that Curaçao accepted refugees without entry permits. Curaçao did not, but the Soviets accepted the visas at face value. The bottleneck was the Japanese transit visa. Without it, refugees could not board ships from Vladivostok to Japan. The Japanese government's policy on Jewish refugees was ambiguous. Japan had no history of anti-Semitism. Jews were so rare in Japan that most Japanese had never met one. But Japan was allied with Nazi Germany through the Anti-Comintern Pact signed in 1936. Germany pressured Japan to adopt anti-Semitic policies. Japan resisted direct adoption of Nazi racial laws, but became increasingly cautious about accepting Jewish refugees. In December 1938, Japan's Five Ministers' Council issued a policy stating that Japan would not expel Jews already in Japanese territory, would treat them fairly, but would control immigration to prevent excessive numbers from entering. The policy was deliberately vague. It did not define excessive. It did not specify what fair treatment meant. Implementation was left to individual consular officials. On July 18, 1940, the refugees at Sugihara's gate needed him to interpret that vague policy in their favor. They needed Japanese transit visas, hundreds of them, thousands eventually, and they needed them immediately because the consulate was closing in 6 weeks. At 0800 hours on July 18th, Sugihara went downstairs to his office. His wife Yukiko was with him. The consulate staff consisted of Sugihara, his wife, who helped with paperwork, and one hired clerk. The consulate was small, just 6 rooms in a rented building. Sugihara opened the front door. Refugees surged forward. Sugihara had the clerk allow 5 people into the building at a time. The others would have to wait outside. The first group entered. They were a Polish-Jewish family, husband, wife, and 3 children. They explained their situation in broken German. Sugihara spoke German fluently. They had fled Warsaw in September 1939. They had obtained a Curacao destination visa from the Dutch consul. They had a Soviet transit visa. They needed a Japanese transit visa to complete the chain. Could Sugihara help them? Sugihara asked them to wait. He told them he needed to contact Tokyo for instructions. The refugees left the office and waited outside. Sugihara composed a telegram to the Foreign Ministry in Tokyo. The telegram explained the situation. Hundreds of Jewish refugees were requesting Japanese transit visas to cross Soviet territory to Japan, en route to other destinations. Most had destination visas to Curacao and Soviet transit visas. Did the Foreign Ministry authorize issuing Japanese transit visas under these circumstances? What were the conditions for approval? Please advise immediately. Sugihara sent the telegram at 0900 hours on July 18th. International telegrams from Lithuania to Tokyo took approximately 24 hours for transmission and response. Sugihara told the refugees he would have an answer the next day. The refugees waited outside the consulate. More arrived throughout the day. By evening, approximately 700 people were camped outside the iron fence. At 0900 hours on July 19th, Sugihara received Tokyo's response. The telegram was brief and unambiguous. The Foreign Ministry stated that Japanese transit visas could only be issued to refugees who met all of the following conditions. First, the refugee must have a valid destination visa to a country that would definitely accept them. Second, the refugee must have sufficient funds to pay for transportation through Japan and to their final destination. Third, the refugee must obtain all necessary transit visas before receiving a Japanese transit visa. The conditions were impossible for most refugees to meet. The Curacao visas were fraudulent. Curacao would not accept the refugees. Tokyo knew this. The requirement for sufficient funds was also unrealistic. Most refugees had fled Poland with whatever cash they could carry. They had no bank accounts, no assets, no way to prove they had money for the entire journey. The third requirement was circular. They needed Soviet transit visas, which they had, but they also needed Japanese transit visas to show Soviet authorities before Soviet authorities would allow them to travel. Tokyo's message was clear. Do not issue visas to these refugees. Sugihara read the telegram 3 times. He understood what Tokyo was ordering. He also understood what refusing these refugees meant. They would be trapped in Lithuania. When the Nazis invaded, which everyone expected, the refugees would be murdered. Sugihara faced a decision. Obey orders and let thousands of people die, or disobey orders and save them. Disobeying meant the end of his career. Possibly criminal charges, certainly disgrace for his family. Japanese culture placed enormous value on obedience to authority, on loyalty to one's superiors, on following orders without question. A diplomat who deliberately disobeyed the Foreign Ministry would be considered not just insubordinate but dishonorable. Sugihara discussed the situation with his wife Yukiko. She later recalled the conversation. Chiune explained Tokyo's orders and the consequences of disobeying. He said that if he obeyed, thousands would die. If he disobeyed, he would be ruined, but the refugees would live. He asked Yukiko what she thought. Yukiko said that even if he lost his job, and they had to beg on the streets, he should issue the visas. Their children might suffer, their lives might be destroyed, but they could not live knowing they had let thousands die because following orders was easier. Sugihara made his decision. At 1100 hours, on July 19, 1940, he called the first group of refugees back into his office. He told them he would issue the visas. The refugees were stunned. They asked if Tokyo had approved. Sugihara did not answer directly. He simply began writing. The Japanese transit visa was handwritten on the refugee's passport. Sugihara filled in the date, the visa type, the duration of permitted stay in Japan, the authorized route of travel, and his signature and official seal. Each visa took approximately 5 minutes to complete. At 5 minutes per visa, Sugihara could process 12 visas per hour. If he worked 10 hours per day, he could process 120 visas per day. There were 700 refugees waiting outside. That was 6 days of work minimum, and more refugees were arriving daily. Sugihara realized he would need to work faster. He simplified the visa format. Instead of filling in every field completely, he used stamps and pre-printed information where possible. He reduced processing time to 3 minutes per visa, 20 visas per hour, 200 visas per day if he worked 10 hours. But Sugihara did not work 10 hours per day. He worked 18 hours per day, from 600 hours when refugees began gathering outside until midnight when his hand could no longer hold a pen. His wife Yukiko helped by preparing passports, organizing refugees into groups, recording names and visa numbers. The clerk handled administrative tasks. For the first 3 days, July 19th through July 21st, Sugihara worked without interruption from Tokyo. He issued approximately 600 visas. He assumed Tokyo would send another telegram ordering him to stop. The telegram arrived on July 22nd. The Foreign Ministry repeated its previous instructions. Transit visas could only be issued to refugees meeting specific conditions. The message implied that Sugihara had misunderstood the original instructions. It did not explicitly state that Sugihara should stop issuing visas, but the intent was clear. Sugihara ignored the telegram. He continued issuing visas. On July 24th, a third telegram arrived from Tokyo. This one was explicit. The Foreign Ministry ordered Sugihara to stop issuing transit visas immediately. Visas already issued would be honored, but no additional visas should be granted. Sugihara read the telegram, filed it, and continued writing visas. He would later explain that he interpreted Tokyo's orders as advisory, not mandatory. As Vice-Consul, he had discretion in emergency situations to make decisions based on local conditions that Tokyo could not understand from 5,000 miles away. This was an emergency. People would die without visas. Therefore, he had authority to issue them regardless of Tokyo's preferences. The explanation was legally dubious. Tokyo's orders were unambiguous, but Sugihara's interpretation gave him a justification that protected him from outright insubordination charges. He was not refusing orders. He was exercising local discretion in an emergency. The distinction was thin but important. Through late July and August 1940, Sugihara issued visas 18 hours per day. His daily routine was mechanical. Wake at 0530 hours, eat a small breakfast. Begin writing visas at 0600 hours when refugees arrived. Write continuously until 1200 hours. Eat lunch while writing. Continue writing until 1800 hours. Eat dinner while writing. Continue writing until midnight. Sleep for 5.5 hours. Repeat. His hand cramped after the first week. He developed writer's cramp so severe he could barely hold chopsticks to eat. Yukiko massaged his hand every night. The pain was constant. He ignored it. His vision blurred from focusing on small handwriting for 18 hours per day. He developed headaches. He ignored them. The stress of knowing he was defying orders, knowing his career was ending, knowing his family would suffer was crushing. He ignored that too. The work was all that mattered. Every visa was a life. Every hour wasted was people dead. The refugees understood what Sugihara was risking. They brought him food which he rarely ate. They offered money which he refused. They thanked him, sometimes crying. Sugihara showed no emotion. He simply wrote, "Next visa, next person, next life." By mid-August, Sugihara had issued approximately 2,000 visas. Each visa typically covered a family, so 2,000 visas represented approximately 4,000 to 5,000 people. The refugees receiving visas departed Kaunas, immediately traveling by train to Moscow, then on the Trans-Siberian Railway to Vladivostok. From Vladivostok, they took ships to Tsuruga, Japan. From Japan, most traveled to Shanghai, Kobe, or other Asian destinations where they waited out the war. On August 28, 1940, Soviet authorities informed Sugihara that the Japanese consulate must close by September 4th. All diplomatic staff must leave Lithuania. Sugihara had 1 week remaining. He issued visas every day. On September 4th, Soviet authorities arrived to enforce the closure. Sugihara was still writing visas. He negotiated a 24-hour extension claiming he needed time to pack files. He spent the 24 hours writing visas. On September 5th, Soviet soldiers arrived to physically remove the Japanese diplomatic staff. Sugihara packed his belongings and prepared to depart. Refugees filled the streets outside the consulate. They knew this was their last chance. Sugihara continued writing visas until the moment he entered the car. Witnesses reported he wrote visas in the car while it was moving. He threw completed visas out the window to refugees running alongside. At the train station, while waiting for the train to Berlin, where he would continue to his next posting, Sugihara sat on a bench and wrote visas for refugees who had followed him to the station. When the train began moving, refugees ran alongside the windows. Sugihara threw unsigned visa stamps to them through the window. He called out that they should forge his signature. His final act as Vice-Consul to Lithuania was encouraging refugees to commit visa fraud using his official stamps. The train carried Sugihara to Berlin, then to Bucharest, where he served briefly, then to Königsberg, then Prague. Throughout 1941 and 1942, Sugihara continued his diplomatic career. Tokyo never formally disciplined him for issuing visas in Kaunas. The Foreign Ministry quietly reassigned him to minor posts away from refugee situations. In 1945, after Japan's surrender, Soviet forces captured Sugihara in Romania, where he had been serving. He spent 18 months in a Soviet POW camp. He was released in 1947 and returned to Japan. In 1947, the Foreign Ministry asked Sugihara to resign. The official reason was post-war reorganization and reduction in diplomatic staff. The actual reason was his insubordination in Lithuania. Sugihara understood. He resigned without protest. At age 47, his diplomatic career was over. He had no pension, no savings, and a family to support. For the next 20 years, Sugihara worked various jobs to support his family. He sold light bulbs door to door. He worked as a translator. He managed export-import businesses. The work was menial compared to his previous career, but Sugihara never complained. His wife Yukiko later said he never regretted issuing the visas, never expressed bitterness about his destroyed career, never second-guessed his decision. In 1968, one of the refugees, Sugihara, had saved a man named Yehoshua Nishri, living in Israel, located Sugihara in Japan. Nishri had been searching for Sugihara for years, wanting to thank him. Nishri arranged for Sugihara to visit Israel in 1969. The visit was transformative. Sugihara met dozens of people he had saved, met their children and grandchildren. He saw physical evidence that his decision in 1940 had created hundreds of living descendants. The refugees explained they had organized. They called themselves Sugihara survivors. They had compiled lists of everyone who had received Sugihara visas. They estimated approximately 6,000 people had received visas directly from Sugihara. Those 6,000 had married, had children, and their children had children. By 1969, there were an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 descendants of Sugihara survivors. In 1985, the State of Israel recognized Sugihara as righteous among the nations, an honor given to non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. Sugihara traveled to Jerusalem to plant a tree in the Garden of the Righteous at Yad Vashem. The ceremonies was attended by dozens of Sugihara survivors and their families. Sugihara was 85 years old, frail but deeply moved. He spoke briefly, saying he had only done what any decent person would do. He had seen people who needed help and he had helped them. He did not consider himself heroic. The audience disagreed. The Japanese government remained silent about Sugihara through the 1980s. Officially, he had violated orders and been appropriately disciplined. Recognizing him as a hero would require admitting that Japanese wartime policies had been wrong. In 1991, 5 years after Sugihara's death, the Japanese government issued a formal apology. Vice Foreign Minister Tino acknowledged that Sugihara had been unjustly forced to resign in 1947. The government posthumously restored his diplomatic rank and apologized to his family. The apology was significant, but came too late for Sugihara to hear it. Chiune Sugihara died on July 31, 1986 in Kamakura, Japan. He was 86 years old. His obituary in Japanese newspapers was brief, noting his diplomatic career and his recognition by Israel. Most Japanese had never heard of him. His funeral was attended by his family and a few diplomatic colleagues. Over the following decades, Sugihara's story became widely known. Books were written, documentaries produced, monuments erected. In Kaunas, Lithuania, the building that housed the Japanese consulate is now a museum dedicated to Sugihara. In Japan, multiple monuments commemorate his actions. In Israel, his tree in the Garden of the Righteous is visited by thousands annually. The number of descendants of Sugihara survivors has grown exponentially. By 2000, the estimate was 40,000 descendants. By 2020, estimates ranged from 60,000 to 100,000. The actual number is unknowable because many survivors immigrated to multiple countries, changed names, lost contact with each other. But demographic studies of refugee populations suggest that 6,000 people of childbearing age in 1940, if they survived the war and reproduced at normal rates, would produce 40,000 to 100,000 descendants by 2020. The entire population exists because Sugihara wrote visas for 18 hours per day in the summer of 1940. The moral calculation Sugihara made was simple but profound. He could obey orders and preserve his career knowing thousands would die. Or he could disobey orders and save them knowing his career would be destroyed. The choice between personal security and moral duty. Sugihara chose duty. The decision cost him everything. His career ended. His reputation was destroyed. His family suffered economic hardship for 20 years. But 6,000 people lived, and their descendants, now numbering in the tens of thousands, exist because a Japanese diplomat decided that human lives were more important than orders from Tokyo. The technical analysis of what Sugihara accomplished is staggering. He issued approximately 6,000 visas in 6 weeks. Working 18 hours per day, that averages 143 visas per day. At 3 minutes per visa, that is 7 hours of continuous writing per day, not counting administrative time, reviewing documents, or managing the queue of refugees. The physical toll was severe. Writers' cramped vision problems, exhaustion. But Sugihara maintained the pace for 6 weeks because stopping meant people died. The psychological toll was worse. Sugihara knew he was ending his career. Every visa he wrote was evidence of insubordination. Tokyo's telegrams ordering him to stop were filed in consulate records. His disobedience was documented. He could not claim ignorance or misunderstanding. He was deliberately, consciously, repeatedly disobeying explicit orders from the foreign ministry. In Japanese culture, that level of insubordination was not just a career-ending mistake. It was dishonorable. It brought shame to his family. It violated every principle of loyalty and obedience that Japanese society valued. Sugihara did it anyway. His decision was not impulsive. He consulted his wife. He considered the consequences. He understood what he was sacrificing. Then he picked up his pen and started writing. The decision was rational, calculated, and coldly pragmatic. Saving 6,000 lives was more important than his career. The math was simple. His career was one man's professional success. 6,000 lives were 6,000 futures, 6,000 families, 6,000 contributions to humanity. The lives outweighed the career. So he wrote. The institutional response to Sugihara's actions reveals the moral bankruptcy of bureaucracy. The foreign ministry knew what Sugihara was doing. They ordered him to stop. He refused. They could have recalled him immediately, sent replacement staff, or simply closed the consulate. They did none of those things. Instead, they allowed him to continue issuing visas while documenting his disobedience to protect themselves from criticism. When the war ended, they fired him for insubordination, but they never prosecuted him or publicly condemned him. The approach was bureaucratically perfect and morally cowardly. They let Sugihara save the refugees, then punished him quietly to maintain official policy. The lesson of Sugihara's actions is that moral courage requires willingness to sacrifice. Sugihara did not save 6,000 people because he found a clever loophole in regulations or because he convinced Tokyo to change policy. He saved them by deliberately consciously violating orders and accepting the consequences. The courage was not in the writing. Anyone can write visas. The courage was in accepting that writing those visas would destroy his life and writing them anyway. The refugees understood this. When they thanked Sugihara, they were not just thanking him for paperwork. They were thanking him for sacrificing his career, his reputation, and his family's security to save people he did not know who could not repay him, who belonged to a religion and culture completely foreign to his experience. Sugihara was not Jewish. He had no personal connection to the refugees. He saved them because they were human beings who would die without help. That was sufficient reason. In 1985, when Sugihara planted his tree in the Garden of the Righteous, he said something that defined his entire life. He said, "I may have to disobey my government, but if I don't, I would be disobeying God." Sugihara was not particularly religious. He was not a Christian or a Jew. He was raised with Buddhist and Shinto traditions, but was not devoutly observant of either. When he referred to God, he meant something more fundamental than organized religion. He meant moral law, the universal principle that human life has value, that saving life is good, that allowing murder is evil. That principle overrode orders from Tokyo. It overrode diplomatic protocol. It overrode career considerations and personal security. When the principle conflicted with government policy, Sugihara chose the principle. The choice defined him. Chiune Sugihara was the diplomat who defied an empire to save 6,000 lives. He issued visas for 18 hours per day for 6 weeks while knowing every visa ended his career. He wrote until Soviet soldiers physically removed him from the consulate. He threw visas from train windows to refugees running alongside. His final act was giving refugees his official stamps and telling them to forge his signature. The 6,000 people who received those visas survived the war. They married, had children, and those children had children. By 2020, there are an estimated 40,000 to 100,000 descendants of Sugihara survivors living around the world. Doctors, teachers, scientists, artists, business people, parents, grandparents, children. An entire population that exists because a Japanese diplomat picked up a pen in the summer of 1940 and wrote visas until his hand bled. Every one of them, every single descendant, owes their existence to Sugihara's decision to disobey orders. That is the legacy. Not the visas themselves, but the choice that created them. The choice to sacrifice everything to save people who could offer nothing in return. The choice to obey conscience rather than authority. The choice to write one more visa, then another for 18 hours per day for 6 weeks, knowing that each visa was evidence of insubordination. Knowing his career was ending, knowing his family would suffer, and writing anyway because human lives were worth more than orders from Tokyo. Sugihara made that choice. He wrote 6,000 visas. He saved 6,000 lives. And now, 80 years later, 100,000 people exist because a diplomat in Lithuania defied his government and did what was right.